In the winter of 1734, a woman named Judith Defoe walked to a London workhouse to collect her 2-year-old daughter. The little girl was called Mary. She had just been given a fresh set of clothes by the parish: a small coat, a little petticoat, stockings, a stay to keep her warm through the cold. For a poor child in Georgian London, that clothing was worth more than almost anything her mother owned. Judith took her daughter out into the freezing night, and somewhere in the dark fields on the edge of the city, she strangled the child, stripped the body, and left it in a ditch. She sold the coat and the stay for a shilling. She sold the petticoat and the stockings for a few pennies more. Then she took the money, walked to the nearest dram shop, and spent every last coin on gin. When she was caught and questioned, she did not deny it. Witnesses said she had told them the very next day that she had done something that deserved the gallows. She was tried, found guilty of the murder of her own child, and hanged. Now, the natural thing to feel here is that Judith Defoe was a monster, and what she did was monstrous. But the men who ran London at the time did not see her as a one-off. They saw her as a symptom, because in that exact stretch of years, the capital of the most powerful trading nation on earth was drowning, not in blood, not in plague, not in war, but in a clear, cheap, juniper-scented liquid that you could buy on almost every street corner for the price of a loaf of bread. They called it Madame Geneva, Mother Gin, and for about 30 years it came very close to tearing the greatest city in the world apart. That was London in the 1730s, but the story of gin doesn't begin in a London gutter. It begins with a berry, a physician's cabinet, and a war fought on the other side of the sea, thousands of miles and hundreds of years away from the nightmare it would one day become. To understand how a medicine turned into a massacre, you have to go all the way back to the beginning. So let's start there. Long before gin had a name, it had an ingredient, the juniper berry, except that it isn't really a berry at all. It's a tiny, dark, blue-black cone from an evergreen shrub, and it grows wild across the cold, damp, rocky corners of Europe. Crush one between your fingers, and you get a sharp, resinous, piney smell, clean and bitter, and a little medicinal. And for almost as long as humans have written anything down, they have believed that this little cone could heal. Nearly 2,000 years ago, a Greek physician named Pedanius Dioscorides, an army doctor who traveled with Roman legions, compiled one of the most important medical texts in all of history, a 5-volume encyclopedia of plants and remedies. Somewhere in those pages he described soaking juniper berries in wine to treat ailments of the chest. That was the ancestor of gin. Not a drink, a prescription. For centuries, that's what juniper was, a medicine. Physicians and monks and herbalists across medieval Europe reached for it again and again. Juniper berries were burned to purify the air in sick rooms. They were boiled into tonics for the stomach and the kidneys. During outbreaks of plague, doctors stuffed the beaks of their masks with juniper and other herbs, convinced the smell could hold back death itself. The berry had a reputation. It was the plant you turned to when your body was failing you. And that reputation ran deep and old. There's a Dutch encyclopedic work from around the year 1270, a sweeping medieval catalogue of the natural world called, beautifully, The Flower of Nature, that already includes a description of a medicine made from juniper berries boiled in wine. That's more than 7.5 centuries ago, and juniper was already a trusted remedy then. So by the time anyone got around to distilling it into a spirit, the humble juniper berry was carrying the weight of well over 1,000 years of belief that it could keep you alive. That history matters because it's the reason gin's inventors reached for juniper in the first place, and it's the reason the drink could later be sold, with a straight face, as something that was good for you. And it grew especially well in one particular corner of the world, the Low Countries, the flat, wet lands that we now call the Netherlands and Belgium. Juniper was native there. It was everywhere. And so it was there in that soggy stretch of northern Europe that someone finally had the idea to combine the old medicine with a new technology. The technology was distillation, the art of boiling a fermented liquid, capturing the vapor, and condensing it back down into something far stronger and purer than what you started with. Distillation had traveled slowly across the medieval world, refined by scholars in the Islamic world, and passed into Europe through monasteries and universities. And by the late Middle Ages, Dutch and Flemish distillers were using it to make a rough spirit out of malted grain. They called the base spirit malt wine. There was just one problem. Early malt wine tasted terrible. The distilling techniques of the time were crude, and what came out of the still was harsh, oily, and unpleasant. So the distillers did the obvious thing. They masked it. They threw in herbs and spices to cover the taste. And the herb they reached for, again and again, was the one everyone already trusted as a medicine. Juniper. The Dutch word for juniper berry is jeneverbs, and so the drink took its name from the berry. Genever. Genever, the father of gin. Now, here's where I have to stop and clear something up, because if you go looking for the origins of gin, you will run into the same tidy little story over and over again. You'll be told that gin was invented by a Dutch physician named Franciscus Sylvius, sometime in the 1600s, as a medicine to flush the kidneys. It's a lovely, clean origin story. A doctor, a cabinet of remedies, a stroke of genius. The trouble is, it almost certainly isn't true. We have written references to Geneva that predate Sylvius by centuries. There's a Flemish text describing juniper boiled in wine from around the year 1269. That's roughly 350 years before Sylvius was even born. The Dutch were already taxing Genever as an alcoholic drink in 1606. Sylvius wasn't born until 1614. A distilling house called Bols was commercializing juniper spirits in Amsterdam by the 1570s. And by the time an English playwright casually dropped the word Geneva into a play in 1623, Sylvius was a 9-year-old child. So no, one doctor did not invent gin in a flash of inspiration. The truth, as it usually is messier and slower and more human. Gin was invented by no one and by everyone. By generations of anonymous distillers in the Low Countries, quietly refining a rough grain spirit and hiding its flaws behind a medicine berry, until one day the medicine had quietly become a drink. The brilliant doctor version of the story was tidied up much later, largely to sell bottles. And it's worth remembering that because it tells you something that runs through this entire episode. The history of gin is absolutely full of convenient stories that people told to make gin look better, or worse, than it really was. But however it was born, Geneva caught on. In 17th century Holland, it was still sold partly as a remedy. Good for gout, good for gallstones, good for a bad stomach. But increasingly, people were drinking it because they liked it. And Holland, at that moment in history, was one of the richest and most dynamic places on the entire planet. Dutch ships ruled the trade routes, Dutch merchants were flooding Europe with goods, and Dutch soldiers were doing an enormous amount of fighting. That fighting is how Geneva crossed the sea. For most of the 15 and 1600s, the Low Countries were a battlefield. The Dutch were in a long, brutal struggle for independence from Catholic Spain. And England, being Protestant and being permanently nervous about Spanish power, kept sending soldiers over to help. Picture those English soldiers. Cold, wet, frightened, waiting in the mud of a Dutch field for the order to advance into cannon fire. And someone hands them a cup of this local grain spirit, this Geneva, to steady their nerves before the killing starts. It warmed them. It blurred the fear. It gave them a jolt of something like bravery, right when they needed it most. There's a phrase we still use today for exactly that feeling. Dutch courage, the bravery that comes out of a bottle. That phrase is a direct fossil, left behind by English soldiers drinking Dutch Geneva on the battlefields of the Low Countries. And when those soldiers survived and sailed home, they brought the taste with them. They couldn't quite manage the Dutch word, so they clipped it and anglicized it. Geneva became Geneva, and then, shorter still, gin. The English had found their drink, but it wasn't yet an English drink. For that, gin needed a king, and in 1688 it got one. In 1688, England did something extraordinary. It effectively fired its own king. The Catholic King James II was pushed off the throne, and in his place the English installed a Protestant Dutch prince, William of Orange, who ruled alongside his wife Mary as William III. Historians call it the Glorious Revolution. And for our story, it matters enormously because England had just handed its crown to a Dutchman whose national drink was gin. Now William did not sit around personally promoting distilleries, but the politics of his reign did the work for him. England and Catholic France were bitter enemies, locked in decades of war. And France's most prestigious export, the drink of the aristocracy, the drink of the enemy, was brandy, French brandy. So the English government made a very deliberate decision. It would strangle the trade in French brandy with heavy taxes and restrictions, and at the very same time, it would encourage its own people to distill spirits at home, out of English grain. It was economic warfare disguised as a drinks policy. Punish the enemy's luxury, boost the home team's farmers, and raise a little tax revenue along the way. In 1690, the government broke the old monopoly that a London guild of distillers had held. Suddenly, almost anyone could distill. You didn't need to be a member of some exclusive club. You didn't need much money. You needed grain, a still, and some juniper, and you were in business. This decision seemed small at the time. It was not, because what the government had just done without fully realizing it was remove every brake from a runaway cart. They had made spirits patriotic. They had made them cheap to produce. They had thrown open the doors to anyone who wanted to make them. And they had done all of this in a city that was swelling with desperate, poor, uprooted people faster than any city in Europe. London was about to become the largest city on the continent, and it was about to discover that it could drown its misery for a penny. The gin craze was coming. To understand what happened next, you have to understand London in the early 1700s. It was a monster of a city, and it was growing at a terrifying pace. Every year, thousands of people poured in from the countryside, driven off the land, chasing work, chasing survival. They crammed into rotting tenements and filthy alleys. There was no clean water to speak of. The Thames was an open sewer. There were no factories yet to give steady work, no police force, no safety net of any kind. If you were poor in London, you were poor in a way that is genuinely hard to imagine now. Cold, hungry, sick, and completely on your own. And into that world came gin. Cheap, strong, and everywhere. Because distilling was now open to all, gin shops multiplied like a fever. By some estimates, at the height of the craze, more than 1,000 illegal distilleries were operating in London alone. And by the middle of the century, there were tens of thousands of places selling gin across England, licensed and unlicensed. In the worst-hit parishes, it was said that as many as 1 in every 4 or 5 houses was selling gin in some form. Out of front rooms, out of cellars, off wheelbarrows, out of the backs of shops that sold something else entirely. You didn't need a tavern, you didn't need a license, you just needed a supply and a doorway. Gin wasn't sold at London. Gin was London, soaked into the walls of the poorest districts until you could barely walk a street without passing a place that would sell you oblivion for a penny. And the price. That's the thing that broke London. Gin became, at its cheapest, cheaper than beer. Cheaper in some cases than clean water, which barely existed anyway. For a single penny you could buy enough gin to get drunk. For 2 pennies you could get, as the famous shop signs promised, dead drunk. And if you passed out from all of it, some of these places would let you sleep it off for free on a pile of straw in the back. That was the actual advertisement, written up on signs across the city. Drunk for a penny, dead drunk for 2 pence, clean straw for nothing. Think about what that offer really meant to a person living in that hell. For the price of almost nothing, you could switch off. You could stop feeling the cold and the hunger and the hopelessness for a few hours. Gin wasn't a luxury for these people. It was an anesthetic, an escape hatch from a life that offered almost no other exits. And they took it, in enormous, staggering quantities. At the peak of the craze, in the 1730s, the numbers historians have pieced together suggest that the average Londoner, man, woman, and effectively child, counting everyone, was drinking something like 2 pints of gin every single week. 2 pints of raw spirit, per person, per week, across an entire city. That is not a nation having a drink. That is a nation drowning. And here is the part that makes it so much worse. The gin they were drinking was not gin as you know it. This was not a clean, botanical, carefully distilled spirit. This was rotgut. Backstreet distillers, working with primitive equipment and no rules whatsoever, produced a product that could be up to twice as strong as modern spirits. And then, to stretch it and cut costs, they doctored it with whatever was cheap and available. Turpentine, to give it a false juniper bite. Sulfuric acid, sometimes worse. There are accounts of gin adulterated with substances that could cause blindness. People were pouring industrial poison down their throats, neat by the pint, because it was the cheapest way to stop being present in their own lives. The consequences were exactly what you'd expect. Public drunkenness on a scale the city had never seen. Violence, neglect, disease, streets full of people insensible in the gutter in the middle of the day. And children, this is the part that the reformers fixated on, and it's the part that still lands hardest. Children caught in the middle of it. Infants given gin to keep them quiet. Mothers so lost to it that they couldn't care for their babies. Which brings us back to where we began. The reformers of the age collected these stories, and they are genuinely horrifying. There was Judith Defoe, whose story opened this episode, the mother who killed her 2-year-old and sold the child's clothes for gin money. There was a woman named Mary Estwick, who drank so much gin that she fell into a stupor and let an infant in her care burn to death. There were reports in the London newspapers of a woman too drunk to wake as her room caught fire, of a man who simply dropped dead on the spot after drinking gin. Gin even picked up a grim collection of female nicknames, Madame Geneva, Mother Gin, the Lady's Delight, because unlike beer, which was a man's drink in a man's tavern, the gin shops let women drink freely, openly, alongside the men, for the first time. Now, I want to be careful and honest here, because this is exactly the kind of history that gets exaggerated. The reformers who collected these stories had an agenda. They wanted gin banned, and horror stories were their weapon. Some of the tales were surely embellished, and the very worst cases, a Judith Defoe, were rare and extreme, not everyday events. Most gin drinkers were not murdering their children. They were just poor people trying to survive an unsurvivable city. But the underlying disaster was real. The public health of London genuinely collapsed. In some years, in some parts of the city, burials wildly outnumbered baptisms. More people were dying than being born, and gin was a huge part of why. Even decades later, sober medical men still blamed something like 1 in 8 adult deaths in London on spirit drinking. This was not moral panic invented out of nothing. It was moral panic wrapped around a genuine catastrophe. And the men who ran the country knew they had to do something. The problem was, almost everything they tried made it worse. Between 1729 and 1751, Parliament passed not 1, not 2, but 5 major laws to try to control gin. 5. And the story of those 5 acts is a masterclass in how a government can throw everything it has at a problem and still, for years, completely fail. The early attempts went hard. The government tried to price gin out of reach with steep taxes and to shut down cellars with expensive licenses and heavy fines. On paper, it looked decisive. In practice, it was a disaster. Because you cannot simply outlaw the only comfort available to hundreds of thousands of desperate people and expect them to nod politely and stop. What actually happened was that the trade went underground. A vast, thriving black market sprang up overnight. Gin didn't disappear. It just went into the shadows, sold in secret, under code names, through hidden doors. And out of that underground world came one of the strangest and most brilliant little stories in the entire history of drink. The story of the talking cat. In 1738, an Irishman named Dudley Bradstreet arrived in London, broke and looking for a scheme. He was, by his own cheerful account, a chancer, a soldier, a spy, a conman, a survivor. And as he watched the mobs roaming the streets desperate for gin they could no longer buy legally, he saw not a tragedy, but an opportunity. There was overwhelming demand. He just had to find a way to supply it without getting caught. So Bradstreet did something almost no one else had thought to do. He actually read the law. He bought a copy of the Gin Act and went through it, line by line, several times. And buried in the legal language, he found a loophole. The authorities, he realized, had no power to simply break down the door of a private house. To prosecute an illegal gin seller, an informer first had to know the name of the person who rented the property. So, if no one knew who was inside the house, if the seller was completely anonymous, the law couldn't touch him. That was the crack Bradstreet drove a cart through. He got an acquaintance to rent a house for him on a lane called Blue Anchor Alley, so that his own name never appeared on the lease. He barricaded himself inside with a stock of good gin bought from a respected distillery. And then, on the outside wall, facing the street, he nailed up a wooden sign in the shape of a cat. Under the cat's paw, he ran a small lead pipe that led back through the wall into the house. Behind the cat's mouth, he cut a slot where coins could be dropped through. Then, he sent word out to the thirsty mob. Tomorrow, gin would be sold by the cat at this window. Just put your money in its mouth. The first morning, Bradstreet waited for hours, and no one came. He was starting to despair. And then, at last, he heard it. The chink of a coin dropping through the slot, and a voice on the other side of the wall saying, in his own words, "Puss, give me 2 pennyworth of gin." Bradstreet put his mouth to the tube, told the customer to collect it from under the cat's paw, measured out the gin, and poured it down the pipe. The coin came in through the cat's mouth. The gin flowed out from under the cat's paw. And at no point did buyer and seller ever see each other's faces. It worked like magic. Word spread across London, and people came in such numbers that, as Bradstreet himself boasted, his neighbors could barely get in and out of their own houses for the crowds outside his window. Customers would approach the sign and call out, "Puss," and if a voice answered, "Mew," they knew gin was flowing that day. In a matter of weeks, the man made a small fortune. He had, without meaning to, invented one of the very first vending machines in human history. And its very first product was illegal gin, dispensed by a wooden cat to evade the law. And of course, London being London, everyone copied him. Cat signs began appearing all over the city. These Puss and Mew shops, as they became known, spread through the slums, and the authorities were largely helpless to stop them. It's a genuinely funny story, a talking cat outwitting the entire British government. But underneath the comedy is something serious. It shows you just how completely the law had failed. Parliament had passed a mighty act to stamp out gin, and the people's answer was to build a wall of anonymous cats and keep right on drinking. And where the comedy of the cats ended, real violence began. Because the other way the government tried to enforce the law was through informers, ordinary people who could earn a cash reward for turning in a gin cellar. You can imagine how that went down in the crowded, tight-knit slums. Informers were despised. They were seen as traitors, selling out their own starving neighbors for a few coins. And when the mob caught one, the results were brutal. Informers were beaten, pelted with filth, dragged through the streets, and in some cases killed outright. The laws, in other words, didn't stop the drinking. They just added corruption, violence, and mob rule on top of it. Officials were bribed to look the other way. Juries flatly refused to convict, and the resentment boiled over into open unrest. When the government tried to tighten the screws, London erupted. Crowds took to the streets, furious, chanting a slogan that tells you everything about how deep this went. They chanted, "No gin, no king." Read that again. The people of London were, in effect, threatening the monarchy itself over the right to drink cheap gin. That is how central this liquid had become to their lives. "Take away our gin," they were saying, "and we will withdraw our loyalty to the crown." The government had created a substance so essential to the survival of the poor that trying to remove it looked, for a moment, like it might trigger a revolution. The reformers realized they were losing, and so they reached for a different kind of weapon. Not a law, a picture. And if you're finding the story of how a drink brought a superpower to its knees as interesting as I do, take 1 second to subscribe. This channel tells a story exactly like this, one drink at a time, every single week. It genuinely helps the channel grow, and there's a lot more coming. Now, back to London, and the single most famous piece of anti-drink propaganda ever made. In 1751, an artist named William Hogarth published one of the most famous images in the entire history of propaganda. He called it Gin Lane. If you have never seen it, find it after this video, because no description does it justice. But let me try. Gin Lane shows a London street consumed by ruin. Buildings crumble and collapse in the background. A man has hanged himself. A corpse is being lowered into a coffin. People pawn the tools of their trade, the pots from their kitchens, the clothes off their backs, just to buy more gin. A starving man gnaws on a bone, fighting a dog for it. And at the very center of the image, the detail that everyone remembers. A mother, slumped in a drunken daze, her legs covered in the sores of syphilis, so lost to the gin that she doesn't notice her own baby slipping out of her arms and falling headfirst over a railing to its death below. It is a nightmare. It is grotesque and hopeless, and it was meant to be. Hogarth published it deliberately cheap, for about £1, far less than his engravings usually cost. Precisely so that ordinary people could afford to buy it and pin it up and absorb the message. And he published it alongside a companion image called Beer Street, which showed the exact opposite. A sunny, prosperous, healthy neighborhood full of happy, well-fed workers drinking good, honest English beer. The message could not have been blunter. Beer is wholesome and British and builds a nation. Gin is foreign poison, and it will destroy you. Now, I want to be straight with you, because this channel's whole promise is that I won't dress up a story to make it neater than it was. Gin Lane was propaganda. It was not a documentary. It was a deliberate, exaggerated piece of persuasion cranked up to its most horrifying extreme to win an argument. Real London had gin misery in it. Absolutely. But it was not literally the collapsing, corpse-strewn hellscape of Hogarth's engraving. He was making a case, not taking a photograph. But here's the thing about propaganda. It doesn't have to be literally true to be effective. And Gin Lane was devastatingly effective. It gave the reformers' argument a face and a feeling. It burned an image into the public mind that no dry statistic ever could. And in the very same year that image went up on walls across London, Parliament tried, for the 5th time, to bring gin under control. The law they passed in 1751 is usually just called the Gin Act of that year, and unlike its 4 failed predecessors, it actually worked. But it worked because, this time, the government was smarter about it. Instead of trying to punish the poor drinkers directly, and instead of relying on hated informers, the new law went after the sellers and the structure of the trade. It made distillers sell only to licensed retailers. It restricted the right to sell gin to premises that were actually respectable. places that paid rent and taxes, real shops with real accountability, not a tap in a back cellar or a coin-operated cat on a wall. It raised the barriers just enough, in just the right places, to start squeezing the chaos out of the system without provoking another riot. But, and this matters because the tidy version of the story likes to give all the credit to the wise lawmakers, the law was not the only thing that killed the gin craze. Maybe not even the main thing. Several forces happened to converge at the same moment, and together they did what no single act of Parliament could. First, the harvests failed. A run of bad grain harvests in the 1750s pushed up the price of grain. That made the grain more valuable to sell as food than to distill into cheap gin, so distillers had less incentive to flood the market. And because bad harvests also drove up food prices and pushed down wages, the poor simply had less spare money to spend on getting drunk. Economics did what morality couldn't. Second, the culture began to shift. A new religious movement, Methodism, was sweeping through exactly the working-class communities that gin had hit hardest, and it preached temperance, self-control, sobriety. Getting blind drunk started slowly to carry a new kind of shame. And third, this is my favorite part, because it links directly to another story we've told on this channel. Gin lost its throne to a rival: tea. In those very same decades, tea was transforming from an expensive luxury into something the poor could afford, as the East India Company's imports poured in and prices fell. By the 1760s, even beggars in the London lanes were drinking tea. It was warm, it was cheap, it was made with boiled water, so it didn't make you sick, and it woke you up instead of knocking you out. One French historian argued flatly that tea simply replaced gin in England. The nation traded one national obsession for another. And this time, the obsession didn't kill its children. The numbers tell the story of the collapse. Gin production in England fell from around 7 million imperial gallons in 1751 to about 4.25 million the very next year, the lowest in 2 decades. And it kept falling. By 1757, after roughly a generation of catastrophe, the gin craze was effectively over. London had, somehow, pulled itself back from the edge. The monster had been tamed. And you might think that would be the end of gin. A shameful chapter, closed, a foreign poison finally driven out of a nation that nearly died of it. But gin didn't die. Gin did something far more interesting. It cleaned itself up, put on a suit, and became respectable. And to understand how a gutter poison became the drink of gentlemen and empire, we have to talk about a machine. For a long time after the craze, gin carried its reputation like a stain. It was still the drink of the poor, still a little shameful, still sweetened heavily with sugar to hide the roughness of the spirit underneath. A style that came to be known as Old Tom Gin. That sweetness was a confession. It was there to cover up the fact that the base spirit still wasn't very good. Then, in 1830, everything changed, because of a still. The man responsible was named Aeneas Coffey. He was a French-born Irishman, and in one of history's great ironies, he had spent years working as a tax official in the spirits trade. An excise man, one of the very people whose job was to police and tax distillers. Who better to understand exactly what was wrong with how spirits were made and how to fix it? Building on an earlier design, Coffey patented an improved version of what's called a continuous still, or column still, and it revolutionized the production of spirits all over the world. Here's why it mattered. The old-fashioned pot still worked in batches. Fill it, boil it, empty it, start again, and it produced a spirit that was still fairly rough and impure, carrying a lot of the heavy, oily flavors that distillers had spent centuries trying to disguise. Coffey's column still could run continuously, without stopping, and it produced a spirit that was dramatically cleaner, purer, and higher in alcohol than anything a pot still could manage. It stripped out the harshness. It gave distillers, for the first time, a truly neutral, crystalline base to work with. And that changed what gin could be. Suddenly, you didn't need all that sugar to hide the flaws, because there were no flaws to hide. Distillers could take this clean, pure spirit and flavor it delicately, with juniper, of course, but also with coriander, with the warm bark called cassia, with the root of the iris flower called orris, and produce something crisp, dry, aromatic, and elegant. Because this new unsweetened style was pioneered largely by distillers based in London, it took the name that gin still carries on bottles around the world today. London Dry. And here's a small fact that trips almost everyone up. London Dry is not a place, it's a style. A London Dry gin does not have to be made anywhere near London. It can be, and is, made all over the planet. The name simply records where the style was born. Dry, meanwhile, just means unsweetened, the opposite of that old sugary old Tom. So the next time you see London Dry gin on a bottle distilled in Spain or Japan or the American Midwest, you'll know you're looking at a 200-year-old label that describes a technique, not a postcode. With a clean product and an elegant new style, gin began its long climb back to respectability. And Victorian London built it a palace. As gin cleaned up, the dingy gin shops of the Craze gave way to something spectacular, the Gin Palace. These were the opposite of everything Hogarth had drawn. Gaslit and glittering, they had polished mahogany counters, walls of etched and gilded mirrors, ornate fittings, and a sense of warmth and grandeur that must have been dazzling to a working person, coming in out of the grey London cold. The Gin Palace deliberately moved gin drinking up in the world, off the gutter and onto the high street, out of shame and into something that felt, for a moment, like glamour. And then gin did something no one drinking it in a Georgian slum could ever have imagined. It went global. It sailed out on the ships of the largest empire the world had ever seen. And it became medicine again. In a way, in the 1800s, the British Empire spread into the tropics, and its soldiers and administrators marched straight into the path of a deadly enemy, malaria. Mosquito-borne, relentless, it killed Europeans in appalling numbers in places like India and West Africa. But there was a treatment. It came from the bark of a South American tree called the cinchona, sometimes nicknamed the fever tree. Inside that bark was a compound called quinine, and quinine genuinely worked against malaria. So British officers in the tropics were dosed with it, day after day, to keep the fever at bay. There was just one problem. Quinine is horribly, punishingly bitter. Choking it down neat was miserable. So people did what people always do with bitter medicine. They tried to make it drinkable. They dissolved the quinine in water, added sugar to fight the bitterness, and carbonated it. And they had invented tonic water. In 1858, a quinine tonic was being sold commercially, and by 1870, the company Schweppes was selling a product it called, tellingly, Indian tonic water, named for the colony where all that anti-malarial quinine was being consumed. And then, some anonymous, thirsty, and frankly brilliant soul in British India took the obvious next step. They were already carrying a daily ration of gin. They were already choking down a daily dose of bitter tonic. Why not combine them? No one knows exactly who did it first. The moment is lost to history. But the result was the gin and tonic, a drink that was, at least in theory, medicinal. The quinine fought the malaria, and the gin made the whole thing a pleasure instead of a chore. It became the signature drink of the British in the tropics, sipped on verandas across the empire as the sun went down. One British prime minister of a later era supposedly joked that gin and tonic had saved more Englishmen's lives and minds than all the doctors in the empire. It's almost certainly an exaggeration, but it captures something real. A drink that had nearly destroyed London had reinvented itself as the drink that helped London's empire survive the tropics. Gin's journey was, by now, almost impossibly strange. It had started as a medicine, become a gutter poison, been blamed for the near collapse of a great city, cleaned itself up through a piece of Irish engineering, dressed itself in mirrors and gaslight, and then sailed off to become medicine all over again on the other side of the world. And it still had one more act left in it. For most of the 20th century, gin coasted. It was respectable now, woven into the cocktail culture of the age, the backbone of the dry martini, the endless summer companion in the gin and tonic. It never disappeared, especially in Britain, where the bond with the drink had never really broken since the Craze. But it also started, slowly, to feel old-fashioned. Your grandparents' drink. As vodka rose to dominate the second half of the century, clean, neutral, mixable, marketed as modern, gin drifted quietly toward the back of the shelf. The dusty bottle, the drink of a previous generation. And then, in 1987, a single new product cracked the whole category back open. It was called Bombay Sapphire, and it came in a striking flat-sided blue bottle that looked like nothing else in the shop. What made it clever wasn't just the packaging, it was the recipe. Bombay Sapphire deliberately turned down the sharp, piney blast of juniper that many younger drinkers found harsh and old-fashioned, and turned up a lighter, softer, more floral blend of botanicals. In one move, it offered a gin that vodka drinkers could actually enjoy, an elegant, approachable, modern spirit. And it worked. It pulled a new generation toward gin, and it reminded people that gin didn't have to taste like your grandfather's medicine cabinet. That crack became a flood. Old, respected names like Plymouth and Beefeater found new life. And then, in the 21st century, came the craft gin explosion. Thousands of small distilleries springing up across the world, each one experimenting with its own wild combinations of botanicals, from cucumber to rose petals to seaweed to tea. Gin became, of all things, fashionable, trendy, a drink you'd travel to a distillery to sip on a guided tour. The same spirit that Hogarth had drawn dropping a baby to its death was now the star of Instagram photos, poured over ice in a balloon glass with a sprig of rosemary and a slice of grapefruit. And in a final twist, gin came full circle in the law itself. Today, in Europe, London dry gin is a legally protected term. To earn that name, a gin has to be made in a specific, disciplined way, flavored only with natural botanicals, with no added sugars and no artificial colors, the exact opposite of the Craze, where once anyone could throw turpentine into a barrel and call it gin. Now the name is guarded, defined, and defended. The gutter poison has become one of the most carefully regulated luxury products in the world. Think about the full arc of that for a second. Gin began as a berry crushed into wine by a Roman army doctor 2,000 years ago. It became a rough-grained spirit hidden behind a medicine in the wet fields of the Low Countries. It steadied the nerves of terrified English soldiers and gave us the phrase Dutch courage. It rode into England on the back of a political grudge against France and a Dutch king and a tax policy. And then it nearly destroyed the greatest city in Europe, drowning London in cheap poison, filling its ditches with the dead, driving a mother to kill her own child for the price of a drink, and provoking riots where the people threatened to abandon their king rather than give up their gin. And it survived all of that. It survived 5 laws and a propaganda campaign designed specifically to wipe it out. It cleaned itself up, went respectable, conquered an empire disguised as medicine, faded into your grandparents' liquor cabinet, and then came roaring back to become one of the most fashionable, most regulated, most beloved spirits on earth. The clear liquid in a gin and tonic on a summer evening looks like the most innocent thing in the world. It looks like nothing, but you are holding 2,000 years of medicine and warfare and empire and catastrophe and redemption in a single glass. A drink that was born to heal, learned to kill, and had to be dragged back from the edge by bad harvests, by a cup of tea, by a tax clerk's machine, and by a city that very nearly drank itself to death and somehow barely chose to stop. Not bad for a poison they once sold for a penny. If you found that as fascinating as I did, subscribe, because on this channel we tell the true, sweeping story behind one drink like this every single week, and gin is only the beginning. And do me a favor, drop a comment and tell me which part of gin's history genuinely surprised you the most. The coin-operated cat, the no gin, no king riots, or the fact that your gin and tonic